All right. Thanks everyone for being able to make it tonight. Just a little background after some of the incidents and racial violence of the last summer in 2020. As many companies and organizations and groups around the country were, Dignity Washington and our board decided to look internally at ways that we need to be better advocates for and stand with both our members that are people of color and others within the DMV region that are people of color that are being, persecuted in many ways in our society. In that front, we decided as a board to undergo a series of sessions, and we've had 3 sessions as a board over the past 8 months to discuss what racism looks like, both in many different regards, and kind of thinking forward and trying to set a path for how we as an organization can become more anti-racist, which is a term that we'll discuss tonight, is how we can be better leading the way, both for our own community members and for in our city being a better partner. With that, we brought along Javi, who is, just went to show his beautiful headshot, but helped us through a number of these sessions to kind of discuss and look at both education to think about where things are right now and help us start asking questions. So we've kind of reached this point where we wanted to bring the community into some of these discussions, because it's really something that we should be doing as a community and not as an individual of leaders that's dictating. But this is good work and important work for us all to be doing, both within Dignity Washington and for Dignity Washington and in our everyday lives for everywhere else that we're engaging within society and other individuals and in our own hearts. So we have Javi is with us, and he is going to go ahead and introduce himself and get us started. But thank you for joining us. And for those that just joined, we are recording at least the portions that Javi will be speaking and doing more of an educational style. We will pause that recording for the moments that we might be opening it up for more discussion, just for people not to feel concerned about speaking up or discussing things, for it to be a space for them to do that. So we'll be stopping and starting that recording. So if you do see the record, I miss a portion, don't hesitate to call me out and get the recordings paused before we start more of an open dialogue so that everybody feels comfortable. So Javi.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. So hi everyone, my name is Javi Rodriguez, as Chris mentioned, pronouns he, him, él. I usually do facilitate with my camera on, but for some reason my computer has been wild, so I'll be turning it off today. So just enjoy the headshot in that portion. There will be opportunities to participate, but as Chris mentioned, this really is meant to serve as a foundation to the conversations that we hope you all have moving forward in the way that you, as an organization, as a community, think about how do you allies, but also what is that internal work? What more could we be doing as individuals to serve as anti-racist? And as Chris mentioned, we'll be sharing that, what that term means later on in tonight's session. But before I do that, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce myself. So I also like to give a disclaimer that I also realize and own I did not do last presentation. I use some language because I want to acknowledge that there's generational differences. And part of that also means acknowledging that some of the language that I use, for example, the word queer, I am able to use it because of the elders and ancestors that fought for our current acceptance, however conditional it is at times. But I also understand that the reasons that I am able to live out and proud is really off the backs of individuals that sacrificed a lot within the community. So at that being said, I also want to say that if this is a word that you don't feel comfortable me using, please feel free to just let me know in the chat. I'm happy to just use LGBTQ+. The reason why I use queer is just because it's more inclusive of the entire community, recognizing individuals that don't identify as gay, lesbian, or trans. We're also going to have opportunities for folks to share in the chat and come off mute. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I'll do my best to monitor it, but also recognizing that I'll be facilitating a good chunk of it. So now we're going to actually introduce myself a little bit. So like I said, Javier Rodriguez. The reason why I use a series of pictures, the board is familiar with the racial autobiography, which is a great opportunity for individuals to just reflect on how they came to understand what race means to them and how race played in their development as individuals. So this asks a series of questions about when did you first find out about race in elementary school, high school, etc. But I just want to give you all just a snippet of where I'm entering these conversations. So I identify as Afro-Latino, Afro-Latinx, whichever. So what exactly does that mean? It means that racially, I am a Black man, but my ethnicities are predominantly from the Latinx community. So that's Dominican and Puerto Rican. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. So like my context of the United States is also different from when I was born on the island and then shifted over to the continental states. I grew up throughout the South. I went to school at an institution that was predominantly Hispanic serving, then went to the Ohio State University for grad school. So you can imagine going from Miami, Florida to Columbus, Ohio was definitely a little different. And then moving to DC, of where I'm at now, working for the DC government. And really what I do is just equity strategy work for the Department of Education and helping our school district move towards an anti-racist approach and supporting our young scholars. So that's a little bit about me. I also like to set some ground rules and expectations of the session. First and foremost, I can't always guarantee a safe space. So I know that's usually language that folks use, just because I can't control what either that I say or maybe one of your peers will say that might have a triggering impact on you. So that's why my colleagues and I like to practice brave spaces. So that is understanding that these will be an uncomfortable space for some individuals. There are some things that will be shared that, of course, are deeply personal for individuals. And because of the nature of the conversations, right, they're not exactly always safe per se. I'll do my best to navigate some of those discomforts and to normalize. I will always model vulnerability. So anytime I ask something, I will also provide I will role model that ask. And yeah. So the group norms, won't spend too much time on this. One thing I like to highlight is, well, of course, we're not technically in person, we're virtual, but I also know that the level of engagement really differs depending on what's going on. You know, you're in your homes, it's the evening time, there's probably food being cooked right now. So I understand, just be as engaged as possible. Ask questions within the chat, or if you need me to clarify something, I'm happy to do that. Vegas rule, it's essentially the stories that are told here will stay here, but the lessons that are learned leave with us moving forward. And that's just really important to think about when individuals are being vulnerable, not exactly coming up and just talking about that later on, right? As you've probably guessed by now, I do like to use humor, because I think it helps to cut the tension and put folks at ease. So I'll at times try to make jokes, if not, just try to laugh at myself so you know, folks don't feel like it's like just a very bogged down conversation, even though, again, recognizing that there will be tons of discomfort. And sharing airtime. This session, it's more of educational foundation, but in the sessions moving forward, you know, we'll have folks participate and engage in really asking individuals that usually sit in the back in terms of not participating or engaging, that you challenge yourself to be engaged. And if you're usually someone that likes to participate, that you hold space for others. And the last one is right to change your mind. Although this is what I do for a living, I also recognize that, I'm not the end all be all. So also look at these conversations as a means to a different perspective and evolve the thinking, especially as we're recognizing the issues that exist today have existed for decades, centuries, etc. So approaching it from a different way outside of your socialization and personal learning would be a good practice to have. In these conversations, we use the grounding courageous conversations compass. And similar to some of the norms that we went through in the last slide, these agreements just allow us to recognize how we're engaging one another and in these discussions. The one I like to highlight is in terms of the agreements, it's speaking your truth, right? We all enter these spaces with different lived experiences, even individuals that may look similar or even grown up in similar circumstances, right? We all have our own truths, and we want you to make sure you're honoring that and not speaking in a generalized manner. Be okay with experiencing discomfort. These conversations specifically around race are usually uncomfortable. Disclaimer, usually for a specific set of individuals, which is what we'll recognize as white individuals, because oftentimes it's an exercise where your reality is being challenged, and it doesn't always feel great. Moving into the conditions, I'll focus on the first two and the last one. So focusing on the personal, local, and immediate just means using examples that are yours and from your experiences. That just helps to really ground that conversation in that personal level that allows for self-reflection. Isolating race is important just because we're having a conversation about systemic racism, white supremacy, and anti-racism, and a portion of that is to isolate race. However, that does not mean that we are dismissing people's multiple identities. For example, I am a Black or Afro-Latino queer man, and like my experiences within my racial development also went hand in hand with my sexual orientation and that identity. And the last one is examining the presence of and role of whiteness, which is usually the most difficult condition to maintain because we often don't challenge whiteness in these conversations or prior to this courageous conversation. And we'll talk through what exactly that means, how that shows up, and what does this mean in this context. And then to the left, you see the compass, which allows us to just check in these conversations. Quickly going through, they're pretty self-explanatory, but this allows us to ask, like, where are you coming into these conversations? Are you coming from a moral believing? Are you coming from a thinking intellectual, and acting and rational, or feeling and emotional? So I'm just gonna ask folks to utilize the chat feature to saying, when we're thinking about today's conversation on a lovely Tuesday evening, how are you entering the space of a foundation in social justice? Are you coming from a thinking, an acting, a feeling, or a believing? Nope, Jeff, you don't have to technically pick one. Thank you, Chris. You were sharing that you're coming from believing. Peter, thinking. Feeling. Thank you, Chris. Tom, thank you. Thinking. So good. Usually, often we enter these spaces from either a thinking and a believing, just because of like the process of these conversations, or even the optimism that these conversations can leave folks with. But when we're thinking about entering, right, it's like, is this a conversation of addressing the moral responsibility of individuals to address issues of race and oppression, which is also fair. I usually come in from a feeling, just because this is what I love to do and have conversations on. And what we want to do is get to spaces where we're entering from one quadrant, but also existing by the end of the presentation in all four. So if you're entering from a thinking phase, we'll get you through some of like the emotional components of it, get you some to the moral, and hopefully leaving with something of how do you act moving forward. So again, thank you so much for engaging in that component as we move forward. So we're going to talk about race, right? And I think that part of these conversations is acknowledging the taboo and discomfort that usually falls into a couple of different whys when it comes to talking about race. These aren't conversations that are new or that are, I would even say, groundbreaking, right? These conversations have been had in multiple vectors. We've seen movements arise several times. But when we're thinking about today in 2021, when we look at the individuals who hold more power in terms of the demographic or the generation, it's important to acknowledge that post the civil rights, the practice was colorblindness is the best approach to not talk about race or not to offend individuals. So that was practiced often to encourage individuals not to consider race or to consider color, to look past it. And being honest, that approach was well-intentioned, but in terms of practice, there was a disconnection between the prejudice, right, of like judging someone based on their race and then acknowledging someone's race and how their life can be made and is made differently due to their racial identity. Two, there's also the worry of saying something wrong or not knowing enough. And that reality is that while we can be empathetic and the best allies, if you're not a person of color, you really can't truly understand the experiences of racism and the trauma of racism. Specifically when we look at Black racial trauma and the trauma that Indigenous individuals faced from the inception of the country to where we are today. And lastly, there is like this worry of messing up or not knowing things because we don't want to be named as someone who doesn't know things or that says things incorrectly. But my suggestion, right, is to get this wariness, right, to start addressing it, start thinking about why we don't often talk about race and really growing that muscle of talking about race. So I want y'all in the chat again to share how often do you talk about race and with whom? Is it family members? Is it your partner, colleagues, etc.? On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest, what level of comfort do you experience during these conversations about race? Write your number. Feel free to keep that to yourself, or if you're willing and vulnerable, share it. And we're just going to ask for 1 or 2 individuals to share where they're at in terms of their comfort. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Chris. Awesome. Love the growth. Yes. All right, so we're seeing, of course, there are always different degrees of comfort. I think that with the things that are going on, it's becoming more and more difficult, right, to not talk about race. And that isn't a bad thing. When we are confronting conversations and even issues and looking at them from how are these issues magnified or disproportionately impacting people based on their race, that's also an important thing to think about. When individuals usually say, you know, we live in a post-racist society, that I think that we can all agree that's not true. As much as we've thought that we've had this cultural reckoning post the civil rights movement, a lot of the same things that individuals marched for and lost their lives for, these things are still occurring. If anything, they've just become a little bit more nefarious and evolved in order to not be as this outright racism that we saw during the civil rights era and before. So when we start thinking about race, right, like there's a lot of definitions about race. There's a lot of misconceptions is not the right word, but there's a lot of conflation between race. And part of that is also due to, particularly in the United States, how we tend to group individuals in order to assimilate, categorize, and make it easier to name folks. So this is a fantastic, fun video that I love with its jelly beans. I'm gonna play. So I invite you all to just listen, and I'll mute myself so it doesn't give you feedback.
Race, ethnicity, and nationality are three terms that get thrown around a lot, and all too often they're used interchangeably, ignored, or just used incorrectly. But each of these words actually has a very distinct meaning, and I'm going to talk about them today using my favorite candy, jelly beans. Let's start with race. Now, you may have heard someone say, race is a human construct, and that's true. Race is a mode of categorization that's based on physical appearance. So in the case of jelly beans, race is color. Because race is based on appearance, to some degree it's ascribed, meaning that people are assigned into racial categories based on what other people see. Even if somebody could be mistaken for a certain racial category, it can still apply to them. These categories are fluid, and our ideas of racial groupings change all the time. It's also important to remember that a person can have parents with two different racial backgrounds. The population of the world is becoming increasingly mixed. But even a person with multiple races will still ultimately belong to a racial category themselves, whether or not it's the same as their parents. Race is a huge factor in daily life, but it isn't the whole picture. The term race does not capture the complexities of ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to the ethnic group or groups that a person belongs to. It's a part of a person's heritage and ancestry. In the case of jelly beans, ethnicity is like the flavor. Two people who are in the same racial group can still have very different ethnicities. For example, all of these are red, but this one is cinnamon and this one is cherry. Two people in the same racial group can and often do have very different backgrounds. It's important to note that there are some groups who are unable to trace their specific ethnic heritage because of things like slavery, assimilation, and genocide. Ethnicity is a huge part of identity formation and development, but it's still not the same as nationality. The word nationality refers to someone's national origin, the country where they hold citizenship. For jelly beans, it's like the bag that a bean comes from. People of the same race or ethnicity can come from all different nations, like the watermelon bean that's in Camo Mix and Kids Mix, or the lemon lime bean that's in all three. And nationality is flexible. If a person immigrates, their nationality can change. People can have dual citizenship or sometimes no citizenship at all. So, now you know. As a quick recap, Race is a mode of categorization based on physical appearance, like the color of a jelly bean. Ethnicity is a person's actual ethnic background based on their ancestry, like the flavor of a jelly bean. And nationality is the place where a person holds citizenship, which is like the jelly bean's bag. Now that you know the difference, you can have a much more comprehensive conversation about identity issues. Thanks for watching.
I hope you enjoyed that video as much as I usually do, especially with jelly beans, one of my favorite snacks.
Hope you enjoyed this video because I totally...
Here we go. There is a very, as mentioned in the video, there's an important distinction between these three terms that are often, like as I mentioned earlier, conflated in the United States. Part of that would be, for example, the use of African American to stand in strictly for Black is what is a common thing, right? So earlier today, I introduced myself as someone who's racially Black and ethnically Puerto Rican and Dominican. And there's also this understanding that we need to, when we're talking about Black issues, right? The African American experience is in of itself a specific experience, right? There's similarities within the individuals who are African American, and then you have things like the gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, et cetera, and there even that experience might differ. But when we start talking about Black issues, is really thinking about individuals that aren't strictly African American. So it could be those who are immigrants from African nations, immigrants from the Caribbean, Latin America, et cetera. It's just important to really parse out these issues. When we kind of smush things together, it doesn't allow us to have correct conversations. And I also like to point out nation of origin, just because oftentimes we really do have these conversations centered on the American experience, or an assumption that these experiences are consistent throughout, but they might differ, especially if you are an individual who is potentially not a citizen, is here undocumented, or also your understanding of race is very different just based on where you're immigrating from. And you often see that when individuals are immigrating from Latin American countries, where race is usually placed on the back burner and nationality and ethnicity is the main drive. But I want to offer up an opportunity for individuals to, reflect through these 4 questions. I want you all to start thinking about, when was the last time you had an honest conversation with yourself about who you are and how you came to understand yourself in the world? When was the last time you felt like you had an honest conversation about race and racism with one of your friends, family members, or colleagues outside of social media? And also outside of just the headlines. How often do you reflect on your race or your idea of your race and its impact on your daily life? And when was the last time you listened empathetically to someone's story, not to respond, but to truly listen to their story to understand who they are? So I'm going to give you about 3. I will also model this. I want to be transparent. So I referenced a little bit earlier of folks who are coming from Latinx communities. So being as knowledgeable as I am now, and as affirmed as I am of my racial identity now, when I was younger, I definitely didn't have conversations based on race, strictly speaking, because of when I say our, I mean the Latinx community, wish to not look at race. So kind of participate in that color blindness, but at acknowledge race. So we pride ourselves in being multiracial and usually being made up of multiple backgrounds. So it really wasn't until later in life when I experienced some fun, and I say fun sarcastically, experiences that forced me to confront race. And even trying to have conversations with my mom. I don't know if you caught it earlier. She's a white Puerto Rican woman, and even her inability to have those conversations with me, just because our experiences are just very different. And then when I think about now, outside of work, I really try to think about issues as they not are applied, but how issues can be influenced based on race. So when I'm thinking about socioeconomic class and like issues of school funding, et cetera, like those are sort of the perspectives I take. Of course, I benefit greatly from this is the work that I do. But yeah, it's totally understandable at times if these aren't conversations that are usually front and center for you outside of these spaces. But I want to offer anyone an opportunity to come off mute and share maybe an answer. So this is where it becomes a little bit more, I would say not intense, but this is where I want to engage you all as you kind of think through what these terms mean to you. I want you to, the words racism, whiteness, white supremacist ideology, and for some reason there's an and there, my bad. But how did you come to understand these definitions? Who taught them to you? When you read these words, what comes to mind? I want you to just hold that in your head and think about, okay, so racism to me means this, whiteness to me means this, white supremacist ideology to me means this. And I also want to acknowledge why it's important to name these terms. And I will also say that the goal of this conversation is to really grow our perspective on the definitions of these, or not just the textual definition of these words, but how these systems and how these words actually apply within our society from a systemic level. And we'll jump right in with everyone's favorite definition of racism. So that this is found by Merriam-Webster, which is of course our go-to for all definitions, which is just a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, and the racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. So of course, on a textual understanding of this definition, it can be assumed that all individuals or any individual that has a racial prejudice can participate in racism. This has been an understanding of how we've been taught racism, how I think oftentimes when individuals say like, you know, reverse racism exists, they use kind of this definition as a foundation. And what my goal is to, first of all, address that, like this definition in its textual nature doesn't really consider, right, because it's just a grouping of words, how this actually plays out in our country or in our society. So last year, through the unrest, there was a lot of conversations of when we say that America has racist foundations or that America has racism, et cetera, like there needs to be an acknowledgement of how racism operates from a systemic level. And this evolved, quote unquote, because this definition has also existed for quite some time, but it was finally added and being pushed into mainstream to view racism not just as this individual and interpersonal interaction, but as a system that oppresses racial groups via social, economic, and political advantage for the benefit of others. So when we're thinking about the United States or the Western world, I would even argue the entire world, we have to start thinking about what systemic oppression or racism from a systemic lens, who that actually benefits. When we're looking from an American context, of course, any individual, even myself as a Black man, as a person of color, I can have racial prejudice to someone. That is something that we can all participate in. But when we look at the keywords here, it's the oppression of racial groups to the social, economic, and political advantage of another racial group, the white racial group. It's understanding that racism is in of itself that racial prejudice plus power, right? Black individuals do not have social, economic, and political advantage over white individuals, neither do any of the other racial minorities. And when we start shifting this view of what racism means as an action, but more of as a system that permeates through not just violent rhetoric and organizations, but as Jeff brought up, education, within the economy, within, I mean, all the voter suppression laws, right? Like they are targeting specific groups of people. Or when you look at it from a racial lens of the racial wealth gap and who has easier accesses to resources, et cetera, right? Like these are disproportional impacts. And this is why we start critiquing them as racist systems, because they disproportionately impact people of color. So as I'm saying this, I also want to provide an opportunity for individuals to take a break, because we love bathroom breaks. So excuse me that joined us a little late. I just have my camera off because I'm having technology issues. But yeah, this is my face, so hello. But we're gonna get started back again. I feel like those 5 minutes flew by, but we'll continue. So right before the break, I asked you all to just kind of think about what the terms whiteness and white supremacy mean to you, how you came to understand what those terms meant. And for the next couple of minutes, we're going to spend some time kind of diving deeper into what these terms mean. And this is where I'll begin to really challenge us to start looking at these terms differently. So this is a very quick video that I think just does a really fantastic job of laying that foundation of whiteness that I would invite you all to just listen to.
This is a video about white. Because to many white people, myself very much included, whiteness is often entirely invisible. Or to put it another way, we rarely think about what it means to be white. White people on our TV screens and in our books are generally framed merely as the norm or the default, in contrast to black people, indigenous people, and people of colour, who are often framed as being entirely defined by their race. Our cultural texts, our media discourse, and our educational curricula thus tacitly encourage us to view whiteness as the absence of race. Other people have racial identities, we don't. As a consequence, we're rarely encouraged to think about the ways in which whiteness structures our lives and the impact that it has on others. The murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by US police officers in recent months, and the ongoing bravery of the Black Lives Matter movement both in the US and across the world, however, has forced many white people who might usually engage little with discussion surrounding race to begin to reckon with the huge impact that it has on the organisation of our society. These heinous acts, merely the latest of many, remind us that racism and anti-blackness do not solely reside in the use of slurs or bad taste jokes, but that racism is a system which guides the priorities of our most powerful institutions, including the state and the police, but also our education systems, our cultural institutions, our media outlets, and more. For white people, part of confronting that system has to involve confronting whiteness, learning to recognize that race is present, even in situations where we've learned to view it as absent. This video then is primarily addressed to my fellow white people.
So the entire video, which is fantastic, and when Christopher and the rest of the board sent out the PowerPoint and resources, which I encourage you all to watch, he has a pretty fantastic set of videos that kind of dive deeper into these concepts and provide a lot of examples. But I really enjoy that he contextualizes whiteness as the reality, right? That most white individuals often don't think about their race, or that white is the default. And when I say the default, I mean, as he stated, right? And when it comes to representation in the media, the curriculum that we learn, the way that when we talk about American history, for example, it's often very much centered on white achievement events. And then when we look at conversations of Black history, for example, it's often very much focused, sometimes a little bit on the slavery aspect, but like, you know, America's being founded, so that's really, really cool at the same time. We talk about emancipation. We jump somehow from emancipation in 1896 to the Civil Rights Movement, but allegedly nothing happened between those time periods in terms of Black contributions to America. Unless you take a course that talks about African-American history, which are usually offered, right, in collegiate settings as an elective. So that's just from an educational standpoint. There's also this idea that, or the reality that when we talk about whiteness, it's kind of synonymous with white advantage, or what is also understood to be white privilege. So again, when folks use the word privilege, I think there's of course an assumption that it is something that has monetary value, or that assumes that maybe you individuals or white individuals didn't struggle, which is not the case, right? Of course, we all have our own lived experiences. We have multiple identities, and it's not to say that white individuals haven't experienced hardship in their life. It means that oftentimes hardship isn't associated with their race. So when we talk about that, it's that their skin color didn't play a negative role in their lives. So that can be the criminalization of, or the lack of criminalization for white bodies and the white identity. What does that mean? That means the fun times in the 80s with the welfare queen propaganda that was associated with Black individuals just living off the state and being lazy. That can also mean the over-incarceration of Black individuals. The association of Black culture with high rates of crime, of broken neighborhoods. Like those are these cultural socializations that points to the Black community and demonizes the Black community, which hasn't happened to the entire like white race. That's not to say that white individuals, of course, ethnicities in the past have faced discrimination. We understand the Irish, the Italians are two examples of white ethnic groups, or realistically predominantly white ethnic groups that experienced discrimination when they came over. We also recognize that white ethnic minorities were able to assimilate into the greater American culture. That is not something that, you know, Black individuals are able to do, to assimilate to the greater culture, the greater white culture of our country. And earlier I mentioned that we need to examine the role of whiteness in conversations in terms of race. And what this really means is, as stated in the video, and as Jeff even brought up within education, is how does whiteness or white supremacist ideology, which is really white dominant culture, how are these ideas upheld, perpetuated, and protected in all facets of our society? So that means who holds power, right, in our society to say, like, this is the norm, these are the values that our country live by, and then the individuals are othered because they do not often fit in these spaces. At the same time, that's also not to dismiss that there are multiple identities and individuals can hold multiple marginalized identities. So for example, a majority of individuals in this space identify as LGBTQ+, as allies or as members of the community. And of course, there is history of oppression within the queer community. While we're having that conversation, we can also have a conversation of how has racism compounded the impacts of queer marginalization. So we look at racism within the queer community. We look at how individuals who are Black trans women who are differently abled, as opposed to a cisgendered man, and how they're able to navigate different environments, right? We can have conversations about queer issues and still look at how does whiteness frame these conversations. And I'm going to use my favorite organization that I like to pick on, which is the HRC, just because of it provides a good contextual example of this when we look at it from a queer lens. So of course, the HRC, one of the premier advocacy groups for our community, and they faced a resounding call, right, to readdress how they support and how they advocate for, and how they even engage conversations about supporting queer issues when a majority of the organization is predominantly white, right? So how are we advocating for the community when only certain portions of the community are represented? And we look at these things of like what happened in Philly a couple of years ago with the addition of the Black and brown stripe, and the calls to really look at the community not just from a white lens, and also honor the history of our community with the individuals who began the movement from the Stonewall riots into today. So of course, Black trans women, Black and brown trans women, gender non-binary individuals, femme individuals that were really at the forefront, but yet often in our conversations take a back seat. So this is
for Sarah.
This, oops, excuse me, calls on us to start looking at and to start addressing. And that same note, it really is evolving our views on white supremacy. So of course, when we hear white supremacy, there are very certain groups that we automatically think of. And that makes perfect sense, right? You have the KKK and neo-Nazis, because these are white supremacist groups. There is no defending that. Yes, these are white supremacist ideologist groups. But as you see in the in the text box, it's looking at white supremacy as an ideology that does encompass the KKK and neo-Nazis, but it's also recognizing that white supremacy is ever present in our institution and cultural assumptions that assign value, morality, goodness, humanity to the white group, while casting people and communities of colors as worthless, immoral, bad, inhumane, and undeserving. So it's to say that, as mentioned in the video, it's the culture that is protected, uplifted, and looked as the standard that in of itself is white supremacy as an ideology, right? It is defended. When we think about assimilation, the expectations of assimilations to individuals, when immigrants come over, what it's expected for them to leave and cast aside in order to blend into society or to American culture. And we start critiquing what is American culture, what we think about as a standard American culture. We often center white values or understandings of behaviors and norms, and not actually look at when we name ourselves a cultural melting pot of the world, right? So when we start shifting our views from racism or racists and white supremacists are strictly individuals who participate in violent forms of attacks on individuals and are very much outright in their racial prejudice, it's very easy for us to call that out, right? And yes, that is like gross and disgusting, and it's good we're not associated with that, right? But there also comes this separation of individuals when they say that they don't view themselves participating, benefiting, and perpetuating these racist systems and institutions. So that is why, if it decides to move forward, here we go. We can also look at some examples of not as quote unquote violent or outright instances of whiteness and white supremacist ideology. With my fun time of looking at the Karens and Beckys of the world. And this is, right, you don't often associate these women, and I'll use Amy Cooper as the example, and she's the young lady in the middle, as an individual who's participating in white supremacy, right? So just to recap of what happened with her, this was around June, if I'm not mistaken, of last year, where she was in a public park with a dog off leash, and a Black man asked her to leash her dog because they were in a space where there were birds everywhere, and dogs are out here running their best lives and stuff, which we love, but can disturb the habitat, right? And the man asked her to leash the dog, and her response to that was to call the police on him. And there's plenty of videos, because I'm thankful the man recorded the incident where she changed her tone of voice. She said that she was being threatened, that she felt like she was in danger. So she used her whiteness as a form of aggression toward this man, right? And you don't look at her and associate it with a white supremacists, who are usually what we have been socialized to understand are people usually from the South, conservative, oftentimes not as quote unquote well educated as individuals, right? But she's herself participating in this ideology. She's using her white body and essentially lying and putting another man's life in jeopardy, because it's understood to know that when a white woman is in danger, especially when we look at the histories of of white women utilizing their whiteness to harm Black men and Black children, they will usually respond very quickly, right? Like you hear it is a white woman being harassed or threatened by a Black man. Like there's connotations to that, right? Then we have the other two women, lovely, I'll just call her character B, out in Oakland, where she called the police on a Black family just existing and having a barbecue and challenging them that you're not supposed to be there, even though it's a public park and they were able to be there. Or character C over here, who questioned a man saying that you don't live in this apartment building. I've never seen you before. I'm going to call the police, right? Like these are also examples of white supremacy. However, the difference is that one is very much outright in your face, affirm that they're like, yep, I'm a whole on white supremacist and yep. But this is more of like these internal practices that again are harming Black individuals, people of color, but perpetuating this like entitlement of we are the norm, we have this authority to do this, when often they don't, right? So again, like I said, the goal of this conversation is to really begin to challenge folks to look at white supremacy and racism, not just as these outright acts of violence, but also see racism as a symptom of white supremacy and white supremacy culture. Racism is not only its violent form, it's also the systems and the culture and norms that allow individuals to participate in this behavior and not face consequences, but that are usually detrimental and traumatizing to Black individuals. So that is this idea of, again, it's an ideology that exists.
Javi, I just want to mention that the woman in the middle, she called the police the same day George Floyd was killed.
Oh, well. Thank you for bringing that up, Peter. Thank you. And I think it's also important to mention that it's not the first time that she participated in that behavior. And also like the conversations that occurred afterwards where she felt that she was being targeted, even though individuals like showed her that she was lying, right? She placed someone in potential jeopardy. And that, again, is an example of it. And I think, you know, it's sometimes easy to say, you know, it's not something that I would do, and it's not a behavior that I would participate in or something that I would value. I'm providing examples that aren't as nefarious, right? I think the three examples of the women are easier to identify once we start like critiquing how has the white dominant culture enforced and emboldened individuals to act in this manner. And we're also going to explore the ways that we all can participate in perpetuating white supremacist culture. So this is where it gets a little personal in terms of practicing the personal, local, and immediate, but very quickly, I want to again separate what prejudice versus racism and white supremacist ideology is. So individual prejudice can refer to, of course, individuals' assumptions, belief, or behaviors. That can be racial discrimination, but also other forms of discrimination that are conscious and unconscious. So these are internal thoughts. For example, the association that dreads or locks are unprofessional, or that they are associated with gang violence and gang activity. So again, these are like internal thoughts, subconsciously, unconsciously. really drawing in on that you can be aware of a lot of them, but there's also those deep rooted unconscious biases. Then there's the interpersonal prejudice. So that's pretty easy to parse out, right? This is that engagement with another individual. And this defined as directly perceived discriminatory interactions between individuals, whether it's in their institutional roles or public and private individuals. Ooh, excuse me. So that can be one of the easiest one to point out of that would be like using a racial slur. But of course, we understand that usually to be a taboo. Racism has done a fantastic job of evolving with the times. There are great articles that kind of critique and look at the evolution of racism in terms of language usage. So part of that could be of they could have complied, or it's an example of that. That's also, again, has racist connotations to it. Institutional, right? This is where it now becomes kind of a separation because the individual, right? Anyone can hold those. Interpersonal, anyone can participate in utilizing a racial slur or having those thoughts and vocalizing them to an individual. The institution is really where it separates where does it go from prejudice to a power-based. And this is like similar shared earlier, the systemic distribution of resources and power. And these can be like laws, it can be policies. For example, Jim Crow and redlining are two ones that come to mind very readily. But it can also be things like homeownership, right? Or who is given preference to home loan credits. I think that there's also been several articles out there where Black homeowners within the DMV area were trying to sell their house and they had a white individual appraise their home and it was undervalued. And then they had someone, I want to say it was a white couple, be the stand-in, and their home was priced above market. And the last one is the societal and cultural. So this is the macro layer, right, of what we're talking about, the normalization of historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal that kind of provide this overarching layer into white supremacy. And taking it a little deeper, as I mentioned, using the tenets of courageous conversations, keeping it local, personal, and immediate. I'm gonna use myself. So individually speaking, this would be previously and could still continuously unlearning a lot of the internalized anti-Blackness. For example, of what is appropriate, not acting quote unquote ghetto, and socialized practices of colorism. On the interpersonal, for me, that would be that past association with individuals or not wanting to be associated. The institutional, where it gets a little tricky, right? Just because I'm not a white individual. However, when I think about me being a light-skinned Black man, there are benefits to the ambiguity of individuals like, oh, like you aren't that, and I've heard some less than fun. You're not an N-word Black, you're just like something Black. And that was the fun times of growing up in some of the areas that I lived. And the social and cultural, using me again as an example, would be the actual socialization of anti-Blackness. So that is what we're fed of being of lighter skin color is better, code switching, or not necessarily code switching, because that's more of a survival instinct, but the assimilation into mannerisms, and then looking at other individuals who do not assimilate as not being smart or less competent. We'll just do that. Me utilizing Dignity Washington as an example, I want you to just think about these levels and kind of look at some of opportunities where this has occurred, what it can look like in different ways. And not saying that this is like what it does happen, but this is how it can show up from an organizational view. Those are individuals who hold subconsciously racist thoughts towards communities of colors. For example, the assumption that Black people are prone to being more aggressive or confrontational and defensive. The interpersonal level could be individuals participating in microaggressions, and after the act, the perpetrator of the microaggression dismisses the feedback by person of color and say something like, "It's not what I meant, I'm a good person, you're taking it too seriously." From an institutional level, it could look like people of color being passed over for leadership opportunities, usually being influenced by subconscious bias. In a societal cultural, from a organizational piece, would look like the mindset that, you know, people of color just simply don't want to be part of the organization, right? That's casting the onus on communities of color rather than looking inward and thinking, how has this organization historically and today, right, contributed to creating unsafe spaces for people of color? Has Dignity Washington actively involved in inclusive practices, events, et cetera? And we've had some really great conversations with the board. So these are the forms of conversations we can start looking at to see, like, what does it mean to be more inclusive, but also how do we, again, not separate ourselves from participating in white supremacist ideology. And it's pretty simple. It's like, what does this matter, right? Well, I've given a lot of examples, and it's because a lot of us, all of us, participate in this regularly. And this is the want to unlearn, move forward, and engage. And oftentimes, microaggressions are a form of this, right? Because we don't view them as these like overt acts of violent racism, but they do have traumatizing impact on individuals, specifically when you start thinking about these microaggressions being compounded and occurring multiple times. So I want to play my fun video. This is the last video I'll be playing for you all, so enjoy. But it also has some language, so I want to put a disclaimer on that, but enjoy.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty.
Can I touch it, please? Can I please?
is fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life.
So I think I love, and oh my goodness, every time I watch, I was like, just catch more and more of like, ugh, the words that were used. I like to show this video because it really allows us to kind of take a step back and look at how we often don't associate microaggressions with being like that bad, right? They're like, oh, it's a one-off comment, or it's not that detrimental. But as stated in the video, right, like these things for the individual that's saying the microaggression, that's one instance for them. But the individual that's receiving, right, it's multiple times that could have occurred, and it adds into trauma of individuals. And again, like once you've been told this multiple times, like the reaction is there. And I think when I have conversations with individuals about microaggressions, it's like, like it's no harm. It was just a joke. And it's like for the individual that's on the receiving end of it, right? Like it's not a joke. And oftentimes it's contributed to exclusion and the emotional burnout. So for our last couple of minutes that we have left, in the next slide, I'm gonna have Chris read out some examples of things that individuals have shared that have occurred in the Dignity Washington community. And I want you all to listen and reflect, but also participate in perspective taking. And I want to say there's probably about 5 or 6 comments. So Chris, feel free when you're ready.
Thank you. When people say you are so articulate, though it may be intended as a compliment, there is the implied statement that they are surprised at a string of sentences being strung together. Presider giving a homily and a day or two before, a presider giving a homily a day or two after a big example of racism occurred, and the homily and service did not mention the incident at all, which was this big elephant in the room that was absent. A few individual members have expressed the viewpoint of, I don't see color. I personally don't like that statement. It tends to try to focus on inclusion, which is appreciated because it is easy to feel like an outsider, but it can diminish one's racial or cultural identity and lead to frustration when that person doesn't easily fit into a larger group. Coming into our own as young adults, some people outside of our immediate community would often comment to our siblings and me how we speak so proper, though more often the statement would be, why do you speak like a white girl or boy? I personally never knew how to respond to this line of questioning, but I knew that those individuals believed that something was wrong or out of place or unnatural, and we were under some obligation to explain ourselves. When someone asks where I'm from and I respond with the particular state, they ask, no, where are you really from? And often a follow-up statement will be, I didn't know there were Black people there. I don't see you as Black, meant as a compliment, but rings loudly as a negative stereotype of being less than. I cannot think of many microaggressions directly from Dignity. Honestly, you quickly learn to ignore things growing up in the South just so it doesn't sour your mood.
Thank you, Chris. And the goal of this, right, is not to, if you were an individual who was involved in it, or if you didn't intervene at the time, it's not to say like put you on the spot, right? It's an opportunity for us to look at or to listen and reflect on how individuals felt in spaces within the community, and also thinking about what is the culture that individuals are contributing to, what is the harm that individuals are contributing to, especially if we again continue to look at these issues of racism as just like these very much like, I am not one of those individuals, right? And we talk through how we all can participate within this system, even as individuals of color, but then also a microaggression, right? That's usually viewed as not as bad, but it is still very much a racist incident. So we want you to just invite folks to reflect, and if you're comfortable in the chat, just respond to one of the three questions on the screen. So what were your initial thoughts or reactions to some of the microaggressions your peers shared via Chris? What have you recognized? Would you have, there we go, recognized some of those experiences as microaggressions, experiences or statements? And lastly, would you recognize some of those statements as racist? Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I think it's, and I was just going through the chat because I did miss some things and I apologize. But yeah, you know, it's again, it's being real with ourselves and recognizing that these statements do occur and they contribute to creating an environment where individuals don't feel safe or don't feel supported, and then of course can either opt out or choose to not engage, because even that of itself, right, is a survival mechanism of not getting caught up in it and just like letting it go, but that still has impacts on individual. Thank you, Peter, for sharing. And yes, Chris, that's, yep, at times it can be oblivious at the moment or not readily recognizable. And we'll definitely have conversations in a future session of how to engage and intervene at that moment. But we're nearing our completion. Asking just for 5 minutes just because we started a little late, but there's this really fun idea, not fun, but that we need to look and address the problem of goodness. So what this means is really looking at the jumping towards defensiveness or dismissing that we participated in a racist comment, or we made a racist comment because we believe ourselves to be fundamentally good people. So what I mean by this is that, like we talked about earlier, of associating racism and white supremacy strictly towards the most violent and aggressive and hateful versions of it allows us to then be like, well, you know, I'm not one of those individuals, right? We get the fun comments, of course, fun being sarcastic of like, I'm not racist, I voted for Obama twice, or I supported Black Lives Matter. I just don't really support the way some individuals are going about liberation, etc. So these are examples of a disassociation of sorts, right? Of I couldn't possibly have made this comment, or that's not what I meant by this comment. And that really, one, again, puts the onus back on the individual that's providing you the feedback, that oftentimes is when someone is checking or intervening in a comment, is usually coming from a place of care because they want you to learn as an individual, or to say like, this is how this statement impacted me, and allows us again to disassociate, like, you know, like, no, you're just taking it too seriously. And that again is putting and placating your comfort and your feelings above the feelings of the individual that are experiencing that harm at the time. So really pushing individuals and pushing you all, encouraging you all to start looking at how these statements, even in what we might consider to not be outright or minimal, as perpetuating harm to another individual. I think for me, that's definitely helped me when I have said things that are sexist and misogynist. And although I like to think that my mom raised a gentleman, that as a cisgendered man, right, I benefit greatly from sexism and misogyny, and I can participate in it even when I view myself as someone who would never do something to outright disrespect a woman. But the socialization of boys will be boys and those sort of statements have given a scapegoat for men to just be like, well, that's just locker room talk, or yada yada. So as we begin to look deeper into ourselves, how we participate in the systems and we perpetuate a system, we can have deeper conversations about how this looks moving forward and addressing issues of white supremacy in, or how we participate within the system of white supremacy, and then of course, replicate and participate in racist practices. So this is a fun little graphic that I like to show folks to just kind of visualize it, moving away from the I cannot be racist or prejudiced because I'm a good person, really separating that sense of goodness and self that we have from the actual actions. Usually someone's not calling you a racist, they're saying that what you said is racist and or prejudiced. And really moving for, I can still be a good person, right? I am a good person and I can still participate in this racist and problematic behavior, but I can work to be better. So that really hones in on receiving the feedback, because of course, oftentimes comes from a place of care. You're acknowledging it and not dismissing the feelings of the individual, and you work to do better and participate in that self-reflection. Because a lot of times what we don't like to acknowledge is that in order to be a good ally and in order to be good stewards of this work, it takes a lot of self-reflection and a lot of unlearning, especially when we think about all the things that we were taught when we were younger and where we are today. So before we end tonight, we're going to just talk very quickly about anti-racism and what this means. So I think that this quote by Dr. Beverly Tatum really encapsulates what anti-racism means, moving away from non-racism. So the quote reads, "I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves. The bystanders belong to the same destinations of those who are actively walking. Some of the bystanders may feel the motion of the conveyor belt, see the active racists ahead of them, and choose to turn around. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they're actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carrying along with the others. And the quote ends with, at the exact same destination. So again, this is challenging this idea that it's not enough to not be an outright supremacist, right? Like that is the bare minimum. The bare minimum is to be a non-racist. In order to move an organization forward and think about how we in Dignity Washington can partner and support and serve as allies, advocate with communities, it's what can be done as an organization to move in the opposite direction. What is the self-work that needs to be done by individuals and those conversations that need to be had internally and in fellowship to move in the opposite direction? Because again, we all participate in this cycle, and if we're not active in moving away from it, we end up at the same destination. So just moving forward in the next session, Christopher will send out 2 readings that I think do a really great job of setting that foundation of what we'll talk about, which is Unpacking the Knapsack and Goodness, both which are written by fantastic individuals that give a pretty good context to what we'll talk about. And the last thing is kind of like the spirit of what I've been kind of trying to weave into our conversations is this quote that equity and justice efforts cannot be placated to the feelings of the privileged. To do so is a service to the most vulnerable. And the spirit of this quote really means that the work is about centering individuals who are most vulnerable and working towards ensuring their liberation and their inclusion. And in the end, it will create an environment or a society that is more equitable and more just for the most vulnerable. So in the past, we've approached it from what is comfortable, what is safe, quote unquote. It really is time, and what anti-racist work calls on us to do is to center the needs of those who are most vulnerable and move forward with them in mind. And that's it.
Thank you, Javi. Yeah, thanks everyone for attending and for this wonderful session. I feel like, I don't know if it's just because I'm a gay man, but every time I feel like we have these discussions, and anytime I feel concerned about microaggressions, I always just have the Avenue Q, Everybody's a Little Bit Racist song to alleviate, acknowledging the fact that we participate in racist behavior, and it's not a problematic, or it's not a thing to get defensive or have the goodness effect of, but to just acknowledge and own and then fix that. I feel like I hum that theme song a number of times whenever having these discussions. But so everybody, those resources are available on our website. I just posted the link to where those resources are. This session is also being recorded and will be posted likely at the same place to share out. So the song is Everybody's a Little Bit Racist on Avenue Q. If nobody's heard it, Avenue Q has a lot of songs that definitely, call some things out. But it's a good song about just acknowledging. Don't get defensive. Just say, yes, I am. Now what? So we looking forward as a board and as a community, we are looking to do a kind of follow-up session to this that will be a little bit more of a discussion based and kind of input based. This was kind of this groundwork to help as a community begin these discussions that will continue over the course of the next year or beyond, as we continue to strive to be a truly anti-racist community and community of individuals. So our next session will likely be at some point in May that we will be a little bit more discussing and talking about ways kind of that starting that next step of what Dignity Washington can be doing within our community and within our city to be a more anti-racist community to both our members that are people of color and those around us. So that's kind of the thing going forward. You're still sharing your screen, Javi, if you're.
Oh,
you're gonna look it up. But so thank you everybody for joining us. Yes, that's it.